for coming. We would like to welcome Erin Garrett to our program this evening. Erin is a natural resources, environment, and energy extension educator for the University of Illinois Extension. She's in the southernmost 5 counties in Illinois, including the confluence of the Mississippi and Ohio rivers and the cities of Cairo and Metropolis. Erin develops and delivers high impact programming to local, statewide audiences to help them develop an appreciation for natural resources and to empower them to make small changes to positively impact the environment. Erin's environmental stewardship programming focuses on why homeowners should consider choosing native plants, how to support native pollinators, how to identify grasses, and identify and manage invasive species, and develop an appreciation for prairie ecosystems. She also is involved in energy programming, and she was part of the Illinois Extension Smart Grid outreach team that developed and delivered the consumer education pertaining to the electric smart grid in Illinois. She also helps homeowners better understand solar and other energy efficiency practices they can put in place at home. Additionally, Erin serves as the local coordinator of the Master Gardener and Master Naturalist programs, providing training and volunteer leadership. She's been instrumental in acquiring and managing funding to support both large-scale food donation gardens and smaller pollinator vegetable garden projects, including one in Metropolis and one in Cairo. Erin earned her master's degree in plant biology from Southern Illinois University in 2017 and her bachelor's degree in environmental studies from the College of St. Benedict in 2015. She has served as a board member for the Southern chapter of the Illinois Native Plant Society from 2017 to 2021. Prior to her time with Extension, Erin was a conservation education representative at the Barkhausen Cache River Wetlands Center for Illinois Department of Natural Resources. And she worked there 3 consecutive summers as a grassland restoration monitoring technician for the Nature Conservancy. Tonight, Erin will be sharing her knowledge with us regarding the ecological benefits of using native plants underneath trees and exploring the options available in choosing shade-tolerant native plants. So please welcome Erin Garrett.
Thank you so much. I am exhausted hearing all the things that you just read that I do. So jack of all trades a little bit. With Extension, they keep us busy, but thank you for inviting me to speak this evening. I'm happy to be here with you. Happy that I could be with you on Zoom since I am at the other end of the state. But I am familiar with your area. I'm from McHenry County originally, so Northern Illinois is home to me. But we'll go ahead and get started. So tonight we're going to be talking about shade gardens. And I like this presentation and wanted to cover this topic because native plants are often associated with full sun pollinator gardens, but that doesn't mean that there isn't a place for natives in a part shade or full shade garden in your yard.
Erin, could I just break in here to ask people if you have questions to put them into the chat. And we can do that as we go along, and at the end, we'll go through those.
Thank you. And I did turn my video off just because the way I have my slides, I don't want to cover up the pretty pictures for you all. All right, so we're going to talk tonight. We're going to talk about the ecological role that our gardens can play. And then we're going to move into the importance of choosing native plants, which I know sounds like we're all on the same page there, but always good to review. We're then going to focus on shade gardens in particular, the role that they can play in our home landscapes in comparison to those full sun native gardens. And then we're going to talk about a little bit of where and how to purchase and plant. Again, you have a plant sale coming up, so that's a great opportunity to get plants. And then the bulk of the talk tonight will be looking at different examples, species profiles of plants that you could add into your garden. And then we're going to finish by looking at a design idea. We're going to use my shade garden as our example for today. So in any native plant talk, I always have to include at least one quote by Doug Tallamy. And this one really speaks to me. He says, "It is now within the power of individual gardeners to do something that we all dream of doing, to make a difference." And when he talks about making a difference, he talks about, or we're talking tonight about making a change in our home landscapes to better support the ecology of our native ecosystems. But let's back up a little bit and start thinking about the role of gardens for us as humans. Of course, this list is not comprehensive, but it includes some of the common reasons we create and maintain gardens in our home landscapes. First and foremost, they're beautiful, right? They add that aesthetic beauty and interest to our yards that makes us feel like we have a sense of place in our home. For many of us, they serve as an outlet for our creativity because we're able to experiment with color, texture, and design in a way that is ever evolving and something we can continue to learn from as we do it over the years. Gardening is also a hobby for many of us. And of course, for those of us that plant vegetable gardens, it's a way to provide food for ourselves or our neighbors. But gardens that we build and maintain, they don't just exist outside of the larger realm of nature, but they're part of that larger scheme of the natural world that surrounds us. So that means that whether we want them to or not, our gardens are performing ecological roles in our environment. So our gardens are serving as habitat for insects, birds, and wildlife. And besides just providing shelter, they also provide food, of course. We have insects that eat the leaves. We have berries or seeds that are produced and eaten by birds and other wildlife. Our gardens can provide water sources as well for insects, birds, and wildlife. And then, of course, depending on what plants you add to your garden, some can aid in the filtration of water and work to improve your soil over time. So these roles and functions, they come with having a garden, but the plants we choose, where we put them, and how we manage our garden all impact that relative strength of the ecological role of our garden. So of course, we're going to talk about adding native plants and how that can boost the ability of your garden to fill this role. So why choose natives? Well, one of the main reasons we talk about is that native plants make or break food webs. And that's because about 90% of insect larvae or plant-eating insects, they're only going to eat the plants with which they've co-evolved over thousands of years. This makes sense that the insects in our environment are going to be adapted to plants that are from the same environment. But why do we care about insects? We're talking about plants today. However, insects are that next trophic level in the food web above plants, and they do a lot of hard work, turning not so easy to digest plant material into what I like to call squishy packets of protein and fat that are easily munched on by birds, mammals, and amphibians. Those are insects, especially caterpillars. So when we plant that native garden, we provide food and habitat, but we are also creating that oasis for those insects as well that are very important. Okay, so one thing to keep in mind when it comes to native plants is that they're not all created equal. And as we're learning and growing in the native plant movement, we're learning which plants pack the most punch. So about 5% of native plants in North America provide 3/4 of all caterpillar food. Okay, and which plants are those? Well, woody plants come out on top. Of the woody plants, the oak is the one that reigns supreme. So oak trees across North America can support over 900 different caterpillars that we have in the US. Oaks are first. Other top producers of caterpillars are cherries, birch, cottonwood, maples, and hickories. If we move on to herbaceous plants, the species that support the highest numbers of caterpillars often are those that grow in full sun. Those include goldenrods, our sunflowers, strawberries, lead plant, and Joe Pye weed. So where does that leave our native plants that grow in the shade? If they only serve as a host plant for just a few caterpillars, should we put in that effort and add them into our landscape? And hopefully, since there's a whole presentation on this, you guessed the answer is yes. When it comes to shade gardens, these native plants provide something that we call a soft landing. this term is more recent that's come out, but hopefully you've heard about it. But this is the next step in our native plant landscaping, is creating these soft landings. So what is it? Well, it's a safe habitat located underneath a tree, specifically for developing pupae, but also providing habitat for other wildlife. So we just said that trees are the largest producers of caterpillars, and while many of them serve as food, others, of course, need to complete their life cycle to become our adult butterflies and moths to lay eggs for the next generation. Many of them, after feeding on these trees, will pupate and drop from the leaves into the leaf litter below. Others will use that leaf litter as cover. Others will blend in or lay their eggs on that leaf litter, okay? If we don't provide habitat under our trees, then we can't help them complete their life cycle. Many of us, myself included, in my lawn, or in my yard, excuse me, I have lawn underneath my trees. I have lawn grass, right? And used to remove my leaves or mulch them, which meant that we're harming those pupae that are in those leaves. And we reduce the cover that serves as protection for those caterpillars over the winter. So if we replace that instead with a shade garden, we create that safe space where mowing doesn't occur and where leaf litter can stay and break down naturally. So that is our soft landing. Here's our example. Where would a caterpillar rather pupate in this really lush native planting on the left, or in this lawn with leaves on it on the right? I'm sure we can all guess that the caterpillar would be much happier in the habitat on the left. So we want to replicate that and put that in our yard. This was a picture I took when I was out hiking. This is my front yard. And what we want to create is something like this, with mostly native plants minus the tulips. This is the red oak rain garden on campus at U of I. Of course, they added in the orange tulips so they could have orange and blue blooming at the same time. But everything else, for the most part, in that garden is planted native. Okay, a question that I get when I give this presentation is, can I plant under my trees without harming them? And yes, you can have plants growing right up next to your trees and it's not going to harm the tree. Look to nature as the example. We see trees interspersed with plants all of the time, right? As long as you're careful when you're establishing your garden not to disturb your tree roots, it's actually very beneficial for those trees to have plants growing right next to them. The rule of thumb is with your initial planting to stay 3 feet out from the trunk. But of course, we know that plants tend to find their way. So if you plant 3 feet out, over time, they'll migrate and move and find the spot that they like. And oftentimes that'll be a lot closer to the tree. The one thing with this is you can't really till up the whole area, right? You're going to have to make small holes. And if you hit a root, just move to the side and try planting there. There are some tree species, of course, if you had a black walnut, for example, that you may be concerned with planting underneath it. But there are some plants, if you do a little bit of research, that can withstand and grow fine next to a walnut, such as bloodroot, a lot of our sedges, spiderwort, spring beauties, those all do fine under a black walnut. So just want to put that one out there because I know a lot of people, that's one of the first questions I get is, can you really plant under every tree? And for the most part, yes. Okay, when should you plant native? Well, deciding the timing of your planting depends on the form of the plant that you get. So typically you'll see for sale 3 different types: bare roots, plugs, and seeds. Seeds are the least expensive and, in my opinion, the least reliable way to start native plants. A lot of the seeds, especially a lot of the plants, excuse me, we're going to talk about today with our spring ephemerals are very difficult to start from seed. So it's not recommended unless you are an expert in that. So what I recommend is planting either bare root or plugs. Here I have some pictures of bare roots that I planted in my garden a couple years ago. And essentially what you're doing is during the dormant season, you are planting the root structure of that plant that's typically 2 to 3 years old when you purchase it. If I remember correctly, the picture on the left, this was a ginger, wild ginger, a Solomon seal up here, and then this was my trout lily. Okay. I like ordering bare root because I like seeing what grows underground. So I like seeing the roots because it's something we don't often get to see. But of course, I also like the instant gratification that comes with planting a plug or a small pot of a native plant. And you can plant these either spring or fall. This is the planting that I did this past fall. I ordered a bunch of plants and put them in, and I'm excited to see them green up this spring. Okay, where to find the plants? Of course, our local native plant nurseries, local plant sales that are going on, or at the farmer's market, and then online nurseries as well. If you're looking for a certain plant that isn't available at your local plant sale and you want to look somewhere else, I recommend looking at the Illinois Native Plant Society's website because they keep a running list of all of the native plant nurseries and plant sales going on throughout Illinois, as well as some neighboring states that will ship to Illinois. For me, I order, since I'm so far down in Southern Illinois, I order a lot of my plants from Missouri, actually, because it's a little bit closer to home than ordering from the Chicago area and having it sent all the way down to me. I also recommend if there's something in particular you're looking for and you are ordering from an online nursery, to order the plant the season before you're looking to plant it. So we're a little bit past when I would start ordering my plants now for spring. Last year I ordered my native plants in January, and they're really good about waiting until the weather conditions are appropriate for you to plant to ship them to you at that time, but you can order them early. And that's the case because even now in March, some of those plants are already sold out because I'm very happy that native plants are growing in popularity so much, but for those of us that are really looking for one or two specific things, it makes it challenging and tricky to get them sometimes. So always think a season ahead. So if you missed something this spring, but you really want it this summer, look to order it for the fall. Okay, next two things I want to talk about are defining shade and defining soil type and moisture, because those are the characteristics we're going to talk about for each plant today. So when it comes to defining shade, we're going to use this definition here, and we're going to split it into light, partial, full, and dense. Okay, so light shade refers to an area that receives between 3 to 5 hours of direct sunlight during the summer. Partial is for an area that gets 2 hours of direct sun or is shaded more than half a day. And then full shade is an area that gets less than 1 hour of direct sunlight. Dense shade is something we're not going to talk about today. It's an area that gets no direct sunlight. So for example, under your evergreen trees or low growing shrubs. And we're not going to focus on plants for dense shade today because there are not that many of them. But we're going to look at light, partial, and full. And you can see the number of trees symbols is going to correspond to how much shade they can tolerate. And you'll see those on the species slides as we go through. Okay, next is soil type and moisture. When we talk about soil types, there's a range between clay, loam, and sand. And what you find is that almost all of the plants that are native for shade gardens will say that they prefer rich, loamy soil. So this doesn't mean that they won't grow in clay soil, for example. I know that's what I have in my garden. They may not grow as well or spread as fast, which could be a benefit to you if you don't want a certain plant to spread and take over your whole garden. It's also worth mentioning the best way to improve your clay soil is to add organic material, and you can do that in a variety of different ways. And there's a lot of resources to help you with that, and that's a whole different talk that we're not going to get into. Another thing to note is when you look at the forest floor, it's typically covered in leaf litter this time of year. So adding that leaf litter is one way to add in your organic matter. Okay. The second thing is soil moisture. This is pretty intuitive. We go on a scale from dry to wet. Music is in the middle. That's our medium or our moderate. And we'll talk about moisture levels for the plants and what they can tolerate today too. Okay, so now that we've covered our background information, we're going to jump into our plant profiles. And when we talk about plants to choose, I like to use these concepts of structural plants, seasonal plants, and ground cover. And this comes from a book called Planting in a Post-Wild World. and that's by Rayner and West, and I'll share that resource again in the chat at the end of the talk today. The book talks about using native plants to create gardens that mimic what you would see in nature. And of course, when we're out on a hike, we don't see plants that are spaced 5 feet apart from each other, surrounded by a sea of mulch. So that's not what we want our native plant garden to look like either. What we would see is structural plants that form the main shape of a landscape, like trees, shrubs, and large perennial wildflowers. We see ground cover plantings, which are really important and often overlooked in our home landscapes. But rather than having bare soil or mulch, having green ground cover is an important aspect of the shade garden. And that can be achieved through a combination of sedges, ferns, and grasses. And then finally, the part that we typically focus on, the most fun part, is the seasonal plants. For the shade garden, that's going to be our wildflowers and especially our spring ephemerals. So that's the 3 categories we're going to break down into today. So we'll get started with our structural plants, and we're not going to spend a lot of time here because we're going to assume that you already have your overstory shade trees in place in your garden, whether it's a maple or an oak or a hickory or any other tree that you have in your yard. We're going to talk about what you can plant underneath it. But what other structural plants are there, lower growing trees or shrubs that you could add into that garden? We'll look at a few examples. So first up is one of my personal favorites, and I'm going to try not to say that about every plant, but redbud is definitely there. And redbud will grow between 12 and 30 feet, so you could definitely plant it under the shade of one of your existing trees. It tolerates that part shade and prefers a moist to medium loam soil, but it does do okay in clay. Of course, it's a popular landscape tree because of those pink flowers that come in spring before it leaves out, and then it produces heart-shaped leaves and bean seed pods because it's a legume. This tree, redbud, supports 22 species of caterpillars, including the Io moth caterpillar, and you'll often see it visited and pollinated by bees. And I didn't mention this earlier, but those caterpillar numbers, that comes from a website called Native Plant Finder, and it is fueled by Doug Tallamy's research. And essentially you can put in your zip code and then search a plant, and it'll tell you how many caterpillars use that plant as a host plant. So these numbers we're talking about today come from my zip code in Southern Illinois. So it might be a little bit different for you in Northern Illinois, but you're welcome to explore that resource and see what those numbers are for you. Okay, next up is flowering dogwood. Another small flowering tree, grows between 10 and 30 feet tall, does well in part to full sun with the same soil conditions as redbud. Okay. The flowers are misleading since what we typically refer to as the white petals are actually bracts, and they surround clusters of very tiny flowers that are replaced by an attractive green foliage with a pointed tip. This one is one of the ones I recommend as a great substitute for a calorie pear. I know I cut down my calorie pear as soon as I moved into the house that I'm in. And if you like that look though of a full white tree before you get leaf out, flowering dogwood is a great option. And dogwoods are great because they support 102 species of caterpillars, including the hickory horned devil, which I have yet to this day to see in person, but I can't wait to. And then of course it's pollinated in early spring by bees and flies. Okay, another good calorie pear substitute is downy serviceberry. This is more of a shrub, but can form a small tree that can grow up to 30 feet tall. Tolerates the wetter or drier side of medium soil moisture, and then does well in either loamy, sandy, or rocky soil. So if you have more sand and rocky soil, this one will do well. It supports 91 species of caterpillars, including the red-spotted admiral caterpillar. All right, next up is spice bush. Spice bush is a shrub that likes light to full shade and can grow between 5 and 15 feet tall. It likes medium to medium wet loamy soil. Its leaves have a very pleasant odor when crushed, and this odor helps make it more deer resistant. Okay, that's what that deer with the cross symbol on the bottom means. Has beautiful, delicate yellow, small flowers in the spring. I just saw the buds of it last week, so I'm waiting for those flowers to bloom. And then the leaves turn yellow in the fall as well, and it produces bright red berries. So very attractive for season interest plant. This one supports 10 species of caterpillars, of course, including the spice bush swallowtail caterpillar, but also the Prometha silk moth caterpillar and the imperial moth caterpillar. Okay, and the last structural plant that we'll look at for today is winterberry holly. This is a shrub that can grow, I've seen anywhere from 5 to 20 feet tall, although I usually see it on the shorter side. Prefers partial shade, but can do okay in full sun or full shade. Likes medium to wet soils and sandy or peaty acidic soil. So if you have those soil conditions, this would be a great plant for you. Very popular landscape plant though, so is adaptable. And of course, holly is dioecious, so that means you have separate male and female plants. So you need to get two if you want a chance of getting berries. It will support 41 species of caterpillars, including the sphinx moth caterpillars, polyphemus moth caterpillars, and oak slug moth caterpillars. Okay, let's move on to our seasonal plants. These are the ones we're often most excited about adding into our garden because they add those pops of color and that different seasonal interest throughout the growing season. We're going to include our spring ephemerals, which are very common in our shade gardens, as well as some other wildflowers. One thing to keep in mind when you're planning your garden is it's very tempting to plant a bunch of spring ephemerals, but what comes with that name ephemeral is that most of them will die back completely to the ground by summertime if they're true ephemerals. So if you had a huge garden of all spring ephemerals, by summertime, you're going to look like you have a really empty garden. So make sure that you add in some of those wildflowers that stick around, that bloom in summer or fall, so that you always have something blooming in your garden. So let's start with some ephemerals. First, we have Virginia bluebells, stunning, stunning purple flowered plant that will spread to form colonies over the years in your garden. Prefers partial to full shade, but you can also find it in sunnier areas. I just last week saw the bluebells coming out of the ground. I was very excited. Likes medium to a bit wet, loamy soil, and the plants will get 1 to 2 feet tall. The foliage will die back by midsummer, so keep that in mind where you plant it. Planting bare roots is recommended for this one in either spring or fall. And bluebells will do okay in clay and has been shown to be more deer resistant. And if you do have that clay soil, it can reduce its ability to spread as quickly, so it might stay more in place. And of course, those tubular flowers that it has allow it to be pollinated by long-tongued bees. These spring beauties are up next. These are a long-lasting spring ephemeral. Last year, I observed some blooming 2 months after the first ones began, so they stick around for a while. They prefer light to full shade, but I have them growing in my lawn, which is not uncommon, and they're in full sun. They like the wetter side of medium loamy soil, and they're very short, only 3 to 6 inches tall. A lot of the times you have to look actively to see that they're there. And of course, their foliage will die back by the middle of summer, even though it's typically just a leaf or two. You can plant these as bare roots, and the recommended time for planting is actually in the summer. Okay, this is one of the first flowers to bloom in the spring and is really important for early foraging insects, including its specialist bee pollinator. Okay, woodland blue phlox is another long-lasting ephemeral. This one, like the bluebells, will spread over time, but it doesn't spread as quickly. Prefers light to full shade and medium loamy soil. It will stay under 2 feet tall, and the best way to plant it is with either bare roots or your potted plants in spring or fall. So it is more adaptable than some of our other plants. Phlox supports 8 species of caterpillars, including the phlox flower moth. It's very aptly named. And then, of course, it will be visited also by long-tongued bees and bee flies and butterflies. Okay, Jacob's ladder is one that I overlooked for quite a long time, but it's rapidly becoming one of my favorites. Another ephemeral that can grow anywhere from full sun to full shade. Prefers medium loamy soil, but I also often find it growing in pretty wet conditions. Relatively short, 6 to 18 inches tall. You can plant plugs, your potted plants or bare roots in spring or fall. So again, this one's pretty flexible and when you can plant it. Has been shown to be deer resistant and is not a really aggressive spreader. It spreads by seeding rather than through rhizomes. So that keeps it a little bit more under control. So overall, I think this is a really lovely little plant to have in the garden. Okay, bloodroot, another spring ephemeral, and this one is much more fleeting. Its bloom window is quite short compared to some of our other ephemerals. I know I've gone seasons where I missed the bloodroot blooming because that window is so short. This one will go dormant in the summer, and the flowers emerge with a small leaf wrapped around the stem that you can see in the photo here. The leaves will continue to grow after the flowers die back. It enjoys part to full shade and medium loamy soil, and of course is quite small in size. And the best time to plant is in spring or fall with a bare root. Also has been shown to be deer resistant. And if we think about that name, bloodroot, we know if you've ever broken a stem off that it contains that acrid reddish juice, and that's not really palatable for a deer, so it keeps them away. It does support one caterpillar species, and it's actually a pest of apple trees, so not necessarily something we want to promote, but it is great to have around as an early plant for the bees to visit and pollinate. One thing I'll mention with bloodroot, and this is the case for many of our ephemerals, is that the seeds are dispersed by ants. I'm not going to try to pronounce the term that starts with an M that is used to describe that because I'm not going to be able to get it out. But essentially, the seeds of many of our spring ephemerals, they have an oil body attached to them called an eleizome. And that attracts ants who pick up the seed, carry it home, eat the oil body, and then dispose of the seed in their garbage pile, essentially. But that results in them spreading the seeds for you and planting them in a new spot. So don't be surprised if you plant bloodroot or some of these other ephemerals in one spot in your garden, and next year they turn up in a completely different spot. It's probably the ants that are moving them around. Okay, some additional plants that are my favorites. I'm trying not to say it every time, but we have the trout lilies, white and yellow trout lily. And these are really lovely plants to have, but they do require patience if you want to add them to your garden and have them bloom. So they take a minimum of 7 years to mature enough to flower, but the display is well worth the wait. When they are growing each year, a plant that's not mature will put out a single leaf, and when it does flower, it will have a pair of leaves. They do well in our light to partial shade, medium to medium wet soils, and grow about 6 inches tall, do best planted as a bare root in spring or fall. Last year, I planted a white trout lily in my yard, and it came up. So I'm 1 year in. This year is going to be year 2. So I have 5 more to go before I have the chance of seeing it flower. Okay. Large flowered bellwort is up next, and this one prefers part to full shade, medium to moist soil. It is pretty short, and one of my favorite things about this plant is the way that the leaves are attached to the stem. If you see in the picture here, you see that leaf completely surrounds the stem, so it looks like the stem just is punched through the leaf like you would take a straw and put it into a juice box. Really unique. I really enjoy that about this plant. And then of course you have that gorgeous tubular upside down yellow flower with those twisted petals. Really, really stunning. They do support one caterpillar, the oak besma, and it is visited by bees and flies. Okay, wild hyacinth is going to be, I think, the last ephemeral that we're going to talk about today. And it does well full sun to part shade. So you can even put this in your full sun pollinator garden. Prefers medium soils. They can be a bit dry or wet. And then it does well in acidic or clay soil as well. Grows 2 feet tall, dies back in the summer. This one does better planting the bulb in the summer or the fall. So I did add this one to my garden last summer. So I am patiently yet impatiently waiting for it to come up this year so I can have that in my garden. It isn't necessarily the fastest grower, but it is a long-lived plant and it will attract bees and flies to come and pollinate. Okay, we're going to move over to some of our longer lasting shade tolerant wildflowers. So these are not true ephemerals. Their foliage will last a lot longer through the season. First up is wild geranium. And this woodland wildflower can grow from full sun to full shade. So it's very adaptable, prefers medium loamy soil. You can plant it as a plug or a bare root in spring, summer, or fall. So really anytime, anytime this plant does well. It will spread over time, so you can easily divide it and spread it to different parts of your garden. It's reported to be deer resistant, supports 23 species of caterpillars, including the white-marked tussock moth. This plant also has a specialist mining bee and is visited by many other small bees as well. Okay. Wild columbine, another staple woodland wildflower that I'm sure many of you already have in your gardens. And of course, this one also grows full sun to full shade. So another really adaptable plant that you can put just about anywhere. It also does well in a huge variety of different soil types, dry to medium, loam, sand, rocky areas. So if you have a difficult spot, try to put a columbine there. Plant either a bare root or a plug, spring or fall. Again, these are considered deer resistant and they support 9 species of caterpillars, including 2 that are named after the columbine. So the columbine dusky wing and the columbine borer moth. And that just goes to show, you know, the reasoning why we're planting these native plants is those insects rely on the plant so much so that they're even named after one another. This one will also be visited by hummingbirds with that red flower and long-tongued bees. I've also heard that this one has been reported to grow well in under pine trees, which is often a very challenging spot to plant in. So if that matches the habitat that you have in your yard, try putting a columbine under your pine tree. Okay, Virginia waterleaf is one of several species of waterleaf that we have in our state. They prefer partial to full shade and moist to dry mesic loamy soil. You can plant them as a bare root or plug in spring or fall. One thing to note with this plant, especially if you have a small garden, is it does spread pretty aggressively through rhizomes. So keep in mind, if you're putting this one in, make sure you have some edging around your garden and maybe choose some plants that also are more aggressive in spread so they can kind of compete with one another and check one another. This one supports 1 caterpillar, the bicolored wood grain caterpillar. And if anyone's ever heard of that, I would like to hear that because that was a new one for me. I'd never heard of it. And it also has a specialist mining bee that will visit it as well. Okay, blue cohosh that was mentioned as being available in your plant sale. So I'm glad I had it in here. This is another wildflower that I actually added to my garden 2 falls ago. Prefers part to full shade, medium loamy soil, but it will tolerate clay, and that's what's in my garden, and it came up. So you have one experience of it working. Grows 1 to 3 feet tall and produces these really unique green flowers that I think are really stunning. I like finding the weirder plants that are non-traditional. So if you give me a green flower, I'm going to try it. Plant it a bare root spring or fall. I planted it as a bare root in the fall. And what you have here are the green flowers, and they will be replaced by blueberries. And just one thing to note, they're not edible to humans, so don't eat them, but birds will eat and spread the seeds. The stem is also rather blue to blue-green in color. And this plant is deer resistant and retains its foliage throughout the season. It did pretty well. Mine lasted well into the fall. Supports 2 species of caterpillars and is also visited by flies, wasps, and bees. Okay, red baneberry is up next, related to and similar in appearance to doll's eyes, if you're familiar with that plant. It's not super common in Illinois as a naturally occurring plant, since northern Illinois is at the southern extent of its range, but still a great one to add to your garden. It has clusters of white flowers that are replaced by these clusters of red berries. The whole plant is toxic to humans, including the berries. So again, don't eat the berries, but that toxicity makes it deer resistant. It's going to prefer light to partial shade and moist to medium soil that is on the more acidic side. And then of course, you've got a whole range of soil types listed there, from sandy to clay loam. This one does prefer cooler weather, so I wouldn't rush to add it to my garden since we have really hot summers down in southern Illinois. But where you all are at, this should do just fine. And you can plant the bare roots in spring or fall. Okay, Golden Alexander's is another great plant. And you've probably heard of it in your full sun pollinator gardens, but it can also do well in partial shade. So you can consider adding it into your shade garden. It's a good plant to transition from your spring ephemerals into your flowering summer plants because it'll bloom in that window for about 3 weeks. It isn't necessarily the longest lived perennial plant, but it should reseed itself. And it does well in dry or wet medium soil and is best planted as a plug in spring or fall. Golden Alexanders will support 4 species of caterpillars, including the black swallowtail. And it's also visited by bees, wasps, flies, and beetles. Okay, I couldn't have a native plant webinar without talking about goldenrod. Of course, many of you have probably, goldenrod, it has a bad reputation, but of course it's not responsible for your allergies. And there are some smaller, more well-behaved species that you could introduce into your garden without them getting out of control. And blue-stemmed goldenrod is one of them. It's pretty well-behaved. It has arching stems and clusters of flowers along the leaf axils, which gives it a different look than the ones that have a terminal cluster just on the end. And the stems of this can be bluish or glaucous, and glaucous means they have a powdery white coating that rubs off on them. It prefers partial to full shade in medium or drier soil that can be loamy, clay, or rocky. Blooms in the fall, August through October, and does best when planted from a plug in spring or fall. There's also been reported to be deer resistant. Didn't have my symbol on that slide. And it supports 112 species of caterpillars. And that's why we love goldenrods, because they are amazing for supporting caterpillars. And one in particular that I like to talk about is the camouflaged looper, which blends in very well into the flowers. And it's very hard to see. I've only seen one once in person, but they're cool little caterpillars to look for. Also visited by short-tongued bees, wasps, and flies. All right, lastly, we're going to look at plants that you can use as ground cover. And they're going to vary in height, but include sedges, grasses, ferns, as well as some wildflowers that can be planted mostly for their foliage, with the added bonus of some flowers. Okay, so first up is wild ginger. Ginger will emerge in the spring, but its foliage will remain throughout the growing season. It prefers full to part shade and likes medium loamy soil. It can do okay if the soil is slightly acidic as well. This one is a spreader. It will form colonies. And so if we're looking to have it as a ground cover, it does a great job. It produces, of course, a dark red flower that you can find under leaf cover at the base of the plant. Can't see it in this picture here. Ginger is deer resistant, and you can plant it as a bare root in spring or fall. It does support 1 caterpillar species, the bold feathered grass moth, and it is visited and pollinated by flies or beetles, flies and beetles, excuse me. Okay, next up is pussy toes. These are another great ground cover option, and there are several species There's two that I've mostly seen for sale, but I just lumped them all together here. They do well in full sun all the way to part shade. So a good one to consider adding into your shade garden. Only a couple of inches tall, and they're grown mostly for their leaves as a ground cover. But I find their flowers really attractive as well. The flowering stalks range in size between 4 to 12 inches. And this plant does really well in poorer soils and drier soils. So if that matches your garden, you can try putting this in there. They are considered deer resistant, and they support 3 species of caterpillars, including the American lady butterfly. They're visited by small bees and flies. Okay, next up is a wildflower, but again, mostly grown for its foliage. We have Solomon seal. This one does get pretty tall, 2 to 4 feet tall, can grow in any light conditions, full sun to full shade, does well in medium soil, and does okay if it's on the drier side. It usually, I've mostly seen it grown 2 feet tall, but this past year I saw one that was almost 5 feet tall, and I couldn't believe that it was the same plant because it was quite large. So be prepared for it to get very large if it's happy. It has flowers that dangle under the arched leaves. You can see the buds here in this picture. And then of course they're replaced with berries later in the season. The leaves turn golden in the fall to add that fall interest. And if you're looking to plant it, look for a bare root to add in spring or fall. Oh, there are the flowers. I knew I had a picture of them. There they are in bloom. Okay, next up is false Solomon seal, also known as Solomon's plume. Has foliage that looks very similar to Solomon seal, but it has a terminal flower cluster instead of having the flowers dangle underneath. So of course, then your berries would be held on the end as well. It's another great ground cover choice with those arching stems. This one tends to be a little bit smaller. And its flowers bloom late spring and are replaced by red striped brown or purple berries in the fall. Likes medium wet to dry soil with loam, but does okay in sandy or rocky soil too. This one will spread slowly through the garden by rhizomes. One thing to keep in mind, this is also called Solomon's plume, like I said, but don't confuse it with starry Solomon's plume, which can spread much more aggressively. And I wouldn't necessarily recommend adding that into your garden. This one is considered deer resistant, and you can plant it as a bare root in spring or fall. Okay, if we look at some ferns, maidenhair fern is the first one we'll look at. And if you're looking for an alternative to your hostas, ferns are a great choice. I really like maidenhair fern because of the interesting U-shape arrangement of the fronds. So you see the central stalk here, and then the fronds are held on this U-shaped arrangement, which is really cool. It also has a black wiry stem, which just gives a different, more delicate look to this plant. They grow up to 2 feet tall and will spread slowly through rhizomes, do well in dry to medium wet soils, and you can plant them as bare roots or potted plants in the spring. And they're also said to be deer resistant. Okay, Christmas fern is next. One of my favorite ferns. I added this into my garden last year. Stays green year round, and you can plant it in light to full shade, medium to medium dry soil. Apparently it doesn't do that well in clay, but I still put it in my garden and mine are doing okay, but that's just after 1 year, so we'll see how long they last. You can plant them as bare roots or potted plants in spring or fall. It is deer resistant and actually does support 3 species of caterpillars. So we usually don't think about ferns as being munched on by caterpillars, but this one is. Other than that, of course, it's not able to be pollinated, but does provide that food for our caterpillars and then provides that habitat. Okay, sensitive fern is another great choice. I really like this because it has wider fronds and doesn't really look like a typical fern. So it provides a different textural contrast in the garden. This one does well as long as it doesn't encounter periods of drought, and it can grow full sun to full shade and will spread through rhizomes. For this one, you want to plant it in the spring, either a bare root or a potted plant. It is deer resistant and supports 5 species of caterpillars. Okay, moving on to a grass. We'll talk about one grass, that's beak grass. This is a great choice for a lower growing spreading grass. It has a pretty limited distribution across Illinois, but it is pretty popular as a landscape grass. And I really like this one because it has the best Latin name, Diarrheana. Just doesn't sound very pleasant, but it's really fun and I like this grass a lot. It spreads through creeping rhizomes. It's pretty clumpy and its leaves and seeds bend over to the side, which you can't see in this picture, but I wanted to highlight the beak shape of the seeds here. It is deer resistant, and this one has been found to do well growing under a black walnut. So that's one grass that you could plant there. And then it will turn a tan golden color in the fall as well. Okay, we'll talk about a couple sedges now. Sedges are a great option for your shade garden as a ground cover. Pennsylvania sedge, the foliage somewhat resembles long grass. So even if you weren't looking to necessarily do a full shade garden, but we're trying to find something that looked like grass that would grow in the shade, you could consider putting in Pennsylvania sedge. Stays under 8 inches tall and it does well in dry soil. Spreads from 3 to 8 inches per year. And you can divide it to help aid its spread. It is deer resistant and you can plant it as a bare root or a potted plant in fall or spring. Okay, that was a very short sedge. If you're looking for a taller sedge, we have graze sedge or burr sedge. And this one prefers wetter soils, but does okay in medium and gets about 3 feet tall. So like I said, this one is much taller. Is deer resistant and you can plant it as a bare root or a potted plant in spring or fall. Okay, that was a lot. That was a lot of different plants, a lot of information. So I wanted to close out today by talking about a design idea. And like I said earlier, we're going to use my garden as an example. So when I moved into my house a couple years ago, there was no native plants, a rather traditional garden with a lot of hostas that were growing. And essentially what I wanted to do was rearrange the hostas and make space for a lot of native plants to be added in. Didn't want to completely start from scratch. So the hostas used to be completely covering this area. I dug them all up, rearranged them, and left this entire front area to add in my native plants. That's my blue cohosh right there that's growing. So just to give you an idea of how you can plan this out, I like to draw things out. This is very simple. I just drew the outline of my garden. And this is somewhat to scale. It's kind of hard to gauge everything, but essentially what I did is I filled in what was in place. Okay, these are the things that I decided I was going to keep for now, and I'll start with the bare spot in the front and add in what I can. So in fall of 2020, I added in a white trout lily here, some wild ginger, some blue cohosh, and some Solomon seal. That was where I started. Okay, and then last summer I planted my wild hyacinth. Throughout the season, I added in some Christmas fern because I actually found them at a big box store. I was excited about that. Added those into my garden. And then this tree here lost its branch that used to come here. So I have a lot more sun. So I added in some prairie dropseed. It's not happy where it is, so I'm probably going to move it. And then this year, I have a friend who's going to give me some celandine poppy. I didn't talk about that one today because it's not in Northern Illinois, but it is native and it is probably my favorite spring wildflower in Southern Illinois. So I'm going to add those in. So that's my plan. It changes as I see what new plants I want to add in or something dies back and I replace it. But this is just one example of how you can add in some of your ground covers, right? I have a lot in the back. And then your seasonal interest, like my poppies, my hyacinth is going to bloom later in the season. Ginger will stick around. Celandine poppy sticks around pretty well. Prairie dropseed is going to be there all year long. So that's just one example to share. Just some resources to mention for you before we end today, and I'll put this in the chat once I stop screen sharing. There's a great native spring ephemeral guide for your home garden that you can find that was developed by some of my colleagues in Extension and in Illinois Indiana Sea Grant. They have a whole series of these brochures and resources that you can find on their website at the redoakraingarden.org/resources. But I wanted to highlight, of course, the spring ephemeral one for you today. A lot of people ask about planting in clay soil. So there is this website by Missouri Botanical Garden. It's not all native plants, I don't think, but there are a lot of them included. A resource about planting under trees. We talked about how that can be a little bit intimidating sometimes. So some tips and tricks for you. And then a couple books, Native Plants in the Home Landscape, as well as Planting in a Post-Wild World, which I mentioned earlier today. Okay, so with that, that's what I have today. I do have an evaluation. If you'd like to give some feedback, I'm always looking to improve my programs. So you can scan the QR code on the screen, or you can go to go.illinois.edu/shadegardeneval. I also put my email on the screen. So if you have a specific question that you want to reach out to after the talk today, you're more than welcome to send me an email as well. And with that, I'm going to stop talking and see if there are any questions, and I will put those resources in the chat for you all.
Very good. Thank you, Erin. I don't see any questions in the chat. So if you have a question, just unmute yourself and speak up. So Erin has put the resources in the evaluation in the chat for you to take a screenshot of, or
I apologize, they didn't hyperlink. Sometimes when I copy and paste, it just doesn't work. But if you save that and then enter them, you should be good. I think I've overwhelmed everyone with information.
no, I think you gave us a very thorough presentation.
Thank
So,
you. And if anyone is interested in a copy of the slides too, you can send me an email and I can send you that message. Again, I know that was a lot of information.
we record this and it'll be posted on our website under our meetings. So you can also go to the recording and watch it again.
I have a question.
Yeah.
You had said something about there was a place to go, Doug Talmy, that would tell you how many
Yes.
species it supports. What was that again?
Yes. The website is called Native Plant Finder.
Okay.
And I will type that in the chat. If you just type that into your search engine, it'll pull that up. And it's a great resource. Like I said, you put in your zip code and then you can search for either a specific plant or you can search for a specific insect, and it will show you either if it's a plant, how many caterpillars it supports. It only shows you the top 15, which I wish it would show you all of them, but it only shows you the top 15 for a plant. Or if there was a specific butterfly you wanted to attract to your garden, you could type that in and see what its host plants are and then plant those plants. So it's a great resource. I use it all of the time. And it's ever evolving as they continue to do more research on these native plants and their pollinators.
Yeah, thank you.
We have a question about, can you talk more about what does well under black walnut trees or refer us?
Yes, I will. And I will put, have a website I'll put in the chat too. So a few that do well, I talked about bloodroot, sensitive fern. A lot of the sedges will do quite well. Phlox, yarrow, spiderwort, and spring beauties. And I will find in my notes that link to that resource and put that in there too for you, so you can have that to refer back to.
So is that through Kentucky?
Yes, that one is. Mhm.
Okay. Kentucky Extension.
Mhm.
Well, if there are no other questions, Linda, do you want to wrap
Hi,
up?
I have a question.
Oh, okay.
Hi, thank you, Erin. I enjoyed your presentation very much.
you.
I am from Illinois. And I don't know, I joined late, but did I miss something? Did you have a discussion about trees at all, or what kind of, or was it just plants? Was there any discussion of trees that I might have missed?
We did talk a little bit about a few lower growing trees that you could add into your understory, but we worked on the assumption that you had your trees already established, and then we're working to plant underneath them.
Okay, thank you. I
Mhm.
lost a red maple tree in my front yard, and I really wanted to replace it, but I wasn't sure what tree would grow well without being too tall and yet attractive.
Mhm. Yeah, there are. So some of the ones I mentioned, we talked about, and again, since if you're in Northern Illinois versus Southern, you may have to look and research, but we talked about redbud and flowering dogwood. Those are shorter,
Okay.
and serviceberry. So those are a few that we mentioned.
Thank you very much.
So-
I heard good things about redbud. Thank you.
Up here, we don't, flowering dogwood just doesn't do well, but we have pagoda dogwood,
There
which
you
is
go.
native here and does
Mhm.
very well in shape.
Oh, good. Okay, that's good to know. I live in LaGrange Park, so I'm close to Chicago, but
Awesome.
Okay.
thank you.
And another great resource, if you're wondering, because sometimes we order right from nurseries that aren't necessarily close to home. If you're not familiar with the USDA plants, if you want
Yes.
to know the historic range of a plant, you can just type it in there and then get an idea if it'll do okay in your area or not. So that's another resource.
Okay, great. Good to know. Thank you again very much.
And Jerry, did you want to mention too that we are recording this and that this can be viewed on our website later? So Michelle, whatever you missed, you'll be able to see the first part of that.
Oh, good. Thank
Yeah.
you. I didn't know that. That's good news. Okay, thank you very much again.
You're welcome.
So if there are no more questions, we will stop the recording and